This season, we're stepping into a special 5-part series called Gutsy Grief with my friend John Jeff Hutter. Together, we're exploring, John Jeff and I, what happens when life stops making sense and the unexpected wisdom that can emerge from the middle of it. Grief isn't only about loss, it's about disruption. The moments when the life we thought we were living suddenly cracks open. In this series, we explore how grief, transition, and major life changes can become raw material for deeper self-knowledge and really a more honest way of living. If you've ever found yourself asking, "Who am I now?" you're in the right place. Let's get started with today's episode. When we last spoke, we were talking about your identity and how life stopped making sense after your dad's suicide, and you began to wrestle with identity. Who am I? Nothing is really the same. And in your book, you talk about the indescribable ick. So can you describe that? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yes, you want me to describe the indescribable, and I will.
Yes, I do. How long did it take you to call it that? Did it take 10 years to call it the
Uh,
indescribable ick? Or...
yeah, it didn't take me 10 years, but it did take me like 6 or 7 and a master's degree to come up with that. So anyone who says that higher education isn't worth it, I will gladly challenge that. But no, seriously, the indescribable ick for me was language to describe things that until that point I couldn't describe, things that I lacked the tool of language to explain. And it began referring to the emotions and experiences that I didn't feel or had been taught weren't congruent with grief. And it was my way of conceptualizing them and putting them in a container that I could work with. So, by the very nature of the name indescribable, it's kind of funny because how can you describe something that's indescribable? But by calling it indescribable and then also giving it the term ick or icky, it at least gave me somewhere to put them so I could look at it, so I could see it. And while initially it described my emotional state, ultimately it helped me better understand my identity later on as well.
It's super brave to dig into these parts of ourselves. These parts of ourselves that really um well they're they're hard to see. They're hard to look at. When we think about the ick, we think about it externally. Like to
Mm,
turn that in as a mirror of what is the indescribable ick for me, and then to stay with it.
yeah.
Can you talk about that? How do you stay with your own indescribable ick?
Oh, I think that you stay with it through curiosity to understand what this is. Because, again, I initially used that term to describe the uncategorized feelings that didn't make sense to me. And they weren't always necessarily only an internal experience. Sometimes the indescribable ick I use to describe external experiences or the feelings I had that were the result of some type of external stimulus. And that's where this idea of identity comes into play because, again, there are so many things that I learned while grieving about who I am or who I thought I was at least that I couldn't explain or experiences that I couldn't explain.
So give us an example of an internal something that you would have used that indescribable ick to describe, and then something externally.
An internal experience was the feeling that my dad's funeral was comical. I think I mentioned that in the last episode. Like that felt icky because I had been conditioned to believe that funerals are not a place for fun. They're not a place for humor. The appropriate emotions for a funeral are sadness, and the tone is reverent, not boisterous or carrying a sense of levity. An external example would be an experience I had at one of my first jobs where during my performance review, my manager described my communication style as dramatic and made a comment that it made others uncomfortable, and then made a reference to my style or manner of dress. And again, keep in mind, like I worked at the home office of a prominent nationwide retailer
Mhm.
targeting like college students. So for that to come up, it felt it's not like I was like wearing jeans in a like in the office of some type of hedge fund. This was like at an apparel brand. So just helpful context. At that time it felt icky because I felt embarrassed. I felt othered. I felt ashamed, yet at the same time felt like I had done something wrong and assumed that I just did not pick up the clue phone to learn how to act in a professional environment. So flash forward, 7, 8, 9 years later, when I learned the term microaggression, that is what I later was able to describe that ick. And so I think this is a good example of the indescribable ick can be used to explain something that we lack language for, and that maybe later on we have language to describe. Because in 2012, the concept of microaggression was not something that was, at least in the mainstream, popularized and discussed.
What I hear you talking about, John Jeff, is that the indescribable ick is sort of the reactions and the experiences when something is incongruent. I hear you talking about incongruence, like it just like how you should be at a funeral versus the reality of how it is, how you should be at work versus the reality as it is. And that incongruence, then we have we have a response to that. We have feelings about that. We have reactions. It makes us feel a certain way. Am I getting that?
So my capstone in my master's degree in human dimensions of organizations, the capstone I wrote was called "The Indescribable Ick: Sense Making of Undefined, Injurious Workplace Experiences Through Storytelling." Um,
Mm.
and with injurious meaning causing injury, and I and so I referred to it as that because it's not so much about the experience or the sensation. It's about the language that we use to describe those things because they don't have language. And so what what I advocate for both in the work I did in grad school and in the book and in my life is that language can be a tool for us to make sense of our lives.
I keep thinking about how how much momentum is created when things are clear. Like and language helps things be clear, whether it's internally something about ourselves or outside of ourselves or between us. If we can name it, I mean, the whole name it and feel it and then you can release it kind of thing.
Yeah.
Naming it does it's almost like it brings online um the right things.
There's research on affect labeling, and what it shows is that simply naming a feeling or saying this is grief, this is rage, this is sadness reduces activity in the parts of the brain, the amygdala,
Mm.
that are the threat monitoring part of the brain. Um, and so if we name it, it actually helps us to better navigate what that actually means.
Interesting. When I think about an ick, or when I think about the indescribable ick, I start thinking about our shadows, our shadowy parts. That can be the same things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's just my term for those undefined things that don't make sense. You can call it a shadow. Someone else can call it the boogeyman. There's so many different things we can use to describe it, and ultimately, it's not about the semantics of the name. It's that we have given ourselves this container to put those things that we can't quite categorize or that we're not ready to categorize into the existing categories that we have.
So you were on this journey, you've gotten through the initial aftermath, and you're beginning to look at life and yourself. And so, what was the process of this container, this indescribable container, helping you begin to see who you wanted to be, or what was incongruent? Or
The thing that surprised me most is how much work showed up in my grief. And what's surprising is how much it showed up for my dad. After my dad died, we discovered 30 years worth of journals hidden in his office. And of course, I spent the following years reading every single entry. And what surprised me the most is that if there were 500 entries, at least 480 of them referenced work in some way. And conversely, family or specific individuals maybe were referenced half of the time. And so it made me very curious about the role that work played in my dad's life. And the more that I read the journals, the more that I saw that he identified work and the work he was doing as his purpose. And I don't want to say that he was conflating the two because he was a business owner. It's not like he was working for someone else and felt called to entrepreneurship or independence and didn't pursue it. He truly was doing his own thing. What I found to be interesting is how much that still showed up as the primary focus in his life and how much maybe his purpose in life changed as he grew older, but he never deviated from that initial pathway of being a business owner. And so I began to reflect both in grief as I'm reading about my dad, these parallel lines between he and I, where I'm reading about this person I've lost and the things that they've left behind and how important work was. And at the same time that I'm doing that, I was, I think, 30 years old and had relocated my life to be closer to family after my dad died and made, I wouldn't say a mistake, but rushed myself back into normalcy, believing that grief was something that I got over. I get back to work, I get back to living my life. And I found myself doing the same thing that my dad had been doing as outlined in his journals, which was centering work so prominently in my life and arguably outsourcing my identity to my job.
whoa. First of all, I'm going to go back just a minute. Finding the journals.
Yeah.
I'm curious what happened in you when you found the journals.
We didn't know that he had kept a journal, period, let alone had been keeping one since he was at the time that I found them, my age. The discovery outside of the shock also felt like this bridge to him
Mm.
and a way to connect to him that I didn't know existed.
And then when you started digging into them, how were you reading them? Were you reading them for what?
Yeah, I mean, I've read them so many times, and every time that I've revisited them, it's been with a different intention. I think the first time I read it, it was to solve the mystery of what happened. The second, third, and fourth time, it was to understand his life. The fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th time, it was to like comparative experience of like, how was my dad different? at my age, and to understand that. And all of the subsequent times that I've gone back to reread them, something new always emerges, and that's why I describe in the book that it it changed the nature of our relationship, because we often think about death as something that is terminal. And this rewired the way that I thought of it, because it offered a new dimension to our relationship. And at the time when I was grappling with identity and with my relationship to work, I spent a lot of time with the journals because I wanted to understand how my dad related to work. And again, when I talk about revisiting it, I thought maybe there's a different perspective I'm missing. What are the thoughts, feelings, and emotions that are related to work? And I would say in the later periods of reading it in recent years, there's a texture to it that I have found related to the way that his emotions were, in a lot of ways, connected to what was going on in work.
When you say outsourcing identity to work, how did you get to that where you able to use the language to say, "Oh, wait, he my dad was centering work.
Yeah.
It was the primary who he was, and I'm on this parallel path." Like, how were you able to put language to that?
Putting language to this idea of outsourcing our identity to work, has truly taken a decade, a lot of reading, a lot of study, both of the world and of my dad and of myself. How I would start with the idea of outsourcing our identity to work is that it began by noticing the patterns in my dad's writing relative to the experiences that I remember as a child. Because many times when I'm reading the entries, especially the ones where I was alive while he was writing them, I would compare my memory of those, of the external experience and the way my dad behaved in the physical world with what he was depicting in his journals, and comparing those two things. And I, of course, did not interact with him at work. I saw him when he would come home on the weekends, and that's the version of my dad I saw. What I found fascinating is um, that despite all of those interactions, that person that I remember doesn't exist in the context of the journals for the most
Mm.
part, because what he is writing about and what he remembers from his day are the experiences at work, the meetings that didn't go well, the deal that fell through, the sale that happened, the the successes, the wins, the battles. And what's interesting is he also tends to frame things at work with this almost like mythological storytelling, where he's battling against the like evils or the opponent, and then all of the other things in his life are almost treated as these mundane details that are in the background, and that work is the foreground. And I think identifying that then made me question how I was doing that in my life. And I remember having an icebreaker uh, at some type of offsite for a new job. And I don't love small talk to begin with, but I especially resist the icebreaker of what are your hobbies, because it always left me feeling like I wasn't interesting enough, or I
Mhm.
didn't have something to share. And as much as that may be true, the more that I went through the motions of resisting those type of icebreakers about hobbies or things I enjoyed outside of work, I realized that it was actually a an inquiry into, why don't I have something to say in this? Is it about the fact that I don't think the hobbies I enjoy are cool or fun or worth mentioning, or is it that they don't exist because I
Huh.
haven't given them space? And what I now can say in retrospect is that it is, in fact, that I didn't have hobbies, because everything, especially in that period after he died where I'd gotten back up on my feet and I was working. If it wasn't work, it wasn't interesting because I had dismissed anything that wasn't related to that as irrelevant to the goal I was pursuing, which was getting a promotion or making more money or feeling important at work. And while I wasn't journaling in the same way that my dad was, I began to see the comparison that I had centered work in the foreground of my life in the same way that my dad had.
There's so many places we could go. This idea of outsourcing ourselves in various ways. We are conditioned, all of us are conditioned in some way to outsource, whether it's boundaries or voice or whatever. So I'm curious, when you think about the grief process, when you begin to realize, oh wait, I've I've made my life super small. I've chosen to make my life super small. Probably some self-preservation and control. Like, if it can be all work and I can manage work well, it makes me think of how your dad talked about that. It's the hero's journey. I'm gonna
Hmm.
make my hero's journey small, so I'm always the victor
Mm-hmm.
in the story. And talk to me a little bit about the grief involved when you begin to realize, "Oh, crap."
Where grief shows up here is that I mean, centering work in our lives puts something that is transactional and an identity that is subject to so much change into such a vulnerable place. I think a lot in the context of professional athletes specifically, even though that isn't something that I have lived experience in. I've read so much about athletes whose identity for much of their lives has been on performing successfully in a high pressure environment. And then what happens when they reach the end of their career? Because unlike other types of jobs, there's a much shorter timeline as a professional athlete. And then this sense of loss because that identity no longer exists. Perhaps athletes may be more primed to navigate that because they go into their careers likely knowing that there is a very clear end date. But then the rest of us who are in other types of careers imagine this continuous progression and one that has a much longer timeline. We get tricked into feeling like this is some type of permanent
Mm.
identity or role that we can settle into. That's what sets us up for heartbreak when layoffs happen, when performance doesn't meet expectations and we are terminated, when we change our minds and decide that we don't actually want to pursue this thing that we thought we did. There's a lot of resistance and grief around that feeling, that sense of losing a dream or wanting to change what we want with our lives. Any type of change can turn into grief.
For most of us, we can say this is who I am for my whole career
Hmm.
without really shaking that up. Talk to me a little bit about the demoting versus destruction. Once you realized that work was centered, you needed to shift that, but you didn't like nuclear blast it.
I had several jobs after my dad died. With each new job, I went in with an intention of the role that I wanted work to play in my life. And each time, intention and reality became more closely aligned. But at least initially, the intention to compartmentalize work in one aspect of my life led to that collapsing of self and work into one identity. To some extent, it's because we live in a culture that very much centers work in our lives. We
Mhm.
spend more time at work than at home. And I think for me the pandemic was the first moment where I began to see more clearly the separation between work and life
Mm.
because we were not seeing, or at least I wasn't seeing coworkers in person. It was all virtual. So to some extent they really didn't exist in my physical life.
Mm.
And that's when I began to see how much I had put work at the center of my life. And I had been through enough situations where I had seen coworkers leave. I had seen coworkers get terminated. I had seen coworkers get laid off. I began to see how precarious jobs were, and that made me begin to question, how can I place something that is so precarious and so fragile into the core of my life? And it also helped me to reevaluate how I approached work. The way that I would describe the evolution over time is I began to see work as a transaction, as I am offering a service in the form of the work that I'm doing in exchange for money. And I think that some of this is cultural because we have, at least in the last like decade and a half, worked in a lot of environments where the company has a mission and a purpose, and that is thrown at us, and we are expected to take that mission and purpose and wear it ourselves as if it's our own mission or purpose. And that's not to say that a clear mission as an organization is not helpful. It is like, if you're a company, you need to know what you're working towards. What's the purpose of this company existing? What are the values that are important in this company? But I think the problem is so many of us have approached that without our own discernment around what our values are or what our mission is. Why do I exist in life? There's a lot of risk going blindly into these organizational value exercises because it can trick us into taking the company values and making them our own, taking the company mission and making it our own. And then what happens when we are no longer there, whether it is by our own choosing or against our will?
What I hear you talking about is I'm really differentiating myself. I can align. It is the difference of outsourcing myself to something or somebody else's values
Yeah.
and really becoming embodied and sovereign in my own
Hmm.
who I am. And so
Yeah.
what did you notice as you begin to do that work of expanding and also grounding into your own self?
The big wake up call for me was beginning to notice the archetype or the identity that I was embodying at work that felt like a different person. I call him corporate Johnny. I caught myself um I don't want to say making myself more palatable, softening my edges to satisfy the needs of the environment or the situation in ways that often weren't congruent with my values. And this came, and I mean, and this showed up in a lot of different ways. It meant being complicit in decisions that I didn't agree with that
Mm,
related to terminating employees. It came in the form of saying yes to some type of initiative or goal that I didn't think was possible. One of the moments this came up the most is when I had to do layoffs at a company. It was the first time that I had been involved in layoffs. I guess in my head, layoffs were something where someone comes to you and says, "The company's going to go under. We have to get rid of people in order to survive." And that's not what this situation was. It was something that felt a lot less urgent, and it felt much more strategic, like there had been a plan all along and that
mm.
I had been gaslit into believing otherwise. And which felt like a betrayal in its own. That's the first time I began to notice that disconnect and separation of who I was and this role I was playing.
How can I begin to be more and more honest with myself first, what I'm noticing in myself and also how I'm showing up, and then being honest, more honest with others?
Yeah, Robert Johnny, this identity I had created, um, was was in some ways existed in order to get promoted, to get noticed. And I think the reason I felt so misaligned with that is because that was no longer a goal of mine. My goal was not to rise the ranks in a company and get paid more and get a big title. Maybe that was when I was younger, but when I identified that that was no longer my goal, it didn't mean abandoning this workplace identity and bringing my full authentic self to work instead. It just became about what that identity or like who that identity was. And so when I began to notice that my goal for work was purely transactional, I wanted to do a good job so that I earned my paycheck so that I could live my life as a human. Corporate Johnny became less about getting noticed and more about um, adapting to the rooms I was in, asking what I believed the right questions, seeking clarity so that I could make sure I was doing my job well, and to some extent also like rounding the parts of myself so as not to ruffle feathers because survival does not require feather ruffling, I would say.
What I hear you saying is so good. First ask, what is the role of work in my life? And then from there, what am I getting from it? What do I want to get from it? How do I want to be in relationship with this? What do you think the biggest benefit is to taking time to explore the indescribable ick, taking time to even ask the question, what's my relationship with work?
Well, I think the value of something like the indescribable ick, which again is my terminology for things I can't explain, is that naming things gives us the power to understand them. The power of asking ourselves, what is the role that I want work to play in my life, is a deviation from the script that we are often given as children when someone in school asks us, what do you want to be when you grow up? If you notice, the question of what do you want to be when you grow up is never about, or I shouldn't say never, is often not about the type of person you are or the things you enjoy. It's about your occupation. And so,
Mhm.
again, we are conditioned from childhood to center our occupation as our identity. So asking yourself, what role do I want work to play in my life disrupts that narrative and changes the script and instead allows you to determine what you want work to be. And what I found for myself when I started asking that question is that I wanted work to be a means to live in this world. And what I mean by that, pure and simple, is a financial transaction. I wanted to do my job, do it well, receive compensation that is fairly tied to the services that I'm providing, and I meet the expectations of that job, period. To compartmentalize work in a way that it allows me to do all of these other things in my life that I want to do. I would argue it actually makes me better at my job because I have said this is very clearly the role that this plays in my life. One of the chapters in the book is called Killing Corporate Johnny, and it's a bit of a misnomer because I'm not saying that we should eliminate these identities that we take on in work in favor of being fully authentic. It's about developing an awareness around what role do we want work to occupy, and then what role do we then play based upon the role that work occupies in our life.
I hear you talking so much about consciously designing our life.
Yeah.
Is there anything else in this conversation around performance, around who work and how it is in our lives, and some of the identity work with that you feel like we haven't touched on that you want to call out?
What grief taught me about the role that work occupied in my life was around inquiry and curiosity and interrogation.
Love
And
that.
so, yeah, and so I'd encourage people not to abandon these things that they've constructed around themselves, but to get curious and to develop the
Yes.
awareness and the insight to understand what's going on so that you can make conscious choices as opposed to defaulting to the conditioning or the scripts that we have learned or acquired throughout our lives.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we close, I want to leave you with this. Grief doesn't ask us to have everything figured out. It asks us to stay curious about who we are becoming, individually and together. Our guests bring such clarity and depth. If you want to explore more of their work, you'll find the links in the show notes. And thank you for joining me and John Jeff on the Unspoken Edge, the place where we name what's missing so you can lead from what matters. If something resonated with you today, share this episode with someone who might need it, or subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And if you're navigating unseen tensions in your leadership or culture, let's connect at mosaiccollaborative.com, because legacy isn't a final chapter. It's what you live into, one conversation at a time.